Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of PS 398. It's finally come time for us to talk about games. Up to this point, we've talked about two problems that emerge in the strategic rationalist point of view of international relations. So we've talked about what is rationality and how easily can we apply the idea of rationality to individuals, which is the initial question of rationality, but then also up to states. And we've begun to see some examples of using logic where states have utility functions, and we've discussed the wrinkles associated with that sort of methodological decision. And then last week, we finally said, well, what happens if there are multiple actors equipped with utility functions who aren't yet fully interactive? They're embedded in a connected enough world because of the problems of scarcity. That scarcity problem connects states even if they aren't fully interactive just yet. And so once we started to think about Pareto analysis, or once we started to think about the bargaining problem in a Pareto space, it became quite clear that this rationalist point of view that we spent the first few weeks developing was very promising. It's just that we didn't yet have a sense about what interaction looked like. We know how scarcity forces there to be some relationship between my utility function and your utility function, but that still isn't enough for us to say, oh, and here's what states do. We haven't really said what are the terms of the interaction. What is the fable? What is the actual fable now that we've created our DC Marvel universe, or our Tolkien universe, or our Martin universe, or whatever? So the first few weeks have been about setting up the universe. Now it's come time for us to talk about what the characters are going to do. So today we talk about games. And game theory is a very important part of international relations theory. It's played a very important role in the development of many concepts over the past 35 or 40 years. That's why you're in this class, presumably. I didn't think that it was just my charm, because if that were the case, I think there'd be two of you. You know, this is when things start to get... We're going to start to really be able to say, imagine the country A and country B walk into a bar. Here's what happens. All right? So because the games that I'll be showing you now have more immediate substantive interest, I don't have to spend so much time here in the front end motivating what we're going to be doing. Today we're going to write out what is the concept of a game, and we will spend an entire week just introducing some of the most common games that one sees, both in learning game theory and in learning international relations theory. So the idea here is that your introduction to games will also be an introduction to game-theoretic international relations. And it's quite plausible that the week could have started today in that sense, which might have been maybe a little bit more in keeping with your priors. But I don't understand why we would want to talk about what a rationalist view of international relations is if we don't know what rationalism is. And I wouldn't want to know how we solve bargaining problems if we didn't know what a bargaining problem was. And I wouldn't want us to give countries utility functions if we hadn't thought hard about preference aggregation. So in other words, I think that what I'm going to start showing you today will matter much more because of all of these underneath the surface details that are often unappreciated and sometimes just outright mocked. It's important to know what sort of commitments we're making before we start to enjoy some of these benefits. But today begin the benefits. So let's keep this super simple. We're going to proceed in 3 blocks. In the A block, I want to talk about an introductory game. I just want to show you your first game, at least in this class. It'll be a game of immediate international relations interest, and that will help us to define the concept of a game. What is a game? How would I know a game when I saw one? How would I be able to differentiate 2 different games? Well, you need a definition. You need to know what a game is. I want to be able to say a game is, and I want it to be sufficiently encoded that I can tell a computer, but sufficiently intuitive that I can tell you. And those are 2 constituencies that aren't always very easy to balance. So I want to say, what's a game? I'm going to show you by way of example, and I'm going to show you by way of explicit definitions. In the B block, I want to finish your tour by showing you some of the most common 2-player games that are used in international relations theory. So by the end of today, between the introductory game and then the rest of the menu, you'll have been shown 5 games. I'm going to show you 5 games today. They come up very often in international relations scholarship. And just more importantly, these are the sort of strategic fables that emerge in somebody's mind after they've taken a class like this, so that when you read the news or if somebody asks you about some historical case, you're not going to be able to explain that all fully, but you do need a way to get your orientation started. And oftentimes these introductory fables that I'll show you in the B block are very useful just to get yourself started, to get a sense about what's going on. And then in the C block, I want to talk about an important concept called dominance that we use to analyze games. We're not going to get all the way into how one analyzes a game, what is a solution concept, that's all going to be in coming weeks. But dominance is something that helps you to learn more about the structure of games, and also is a useful starting point for any analysis of a game. Strict dominance in particular is a nice way for us to think about scope conditions under which a certain game is interesting versus not interesting. So we're here, we've made it. 1/3 of the way in, we discussed no games, and now we're going to spend 2/3 of the class discussing games and their role in international relations theory. I'm really excited to show these things to you because, at least from the conversations I've been having, one, I know that you're really ready for this, but two, I also think that at least several of you, many of you, have internalized a lot of these concepts we've used up to this point. So I can't wait to see how much you enjoy this now that I know that you've understood some of these underlying foundations. So it's time. Let's get started. So suppose that the world had two superpowers. Call them superpower A and superpower B. It's probably not very hard to put real proper nouns on that if you're so inclined, be it historical or perhaps looking toward the future. Who knows? And suppose that these superpowers were not interested in direct conflict at the time, because interstate war by superpowers is an incredibly costly process. Every millimeter of this picture matters. They don't want to get involved with that. But they do want to make sure that they're still in the dominant position, right? So they're going to jockey for position through an arms race rather than through direct conflict. And so it's interesting to think about how two superpowers would navigate that process of either building new weapons or managing to keep your arsenal the same while the other one engaged in some denuclearization or something like that. So how does that look? What happens when two superpowers are deciding how to make their armament decisions in the absence of direct conflict? So the idea is the following. Superpower A can either decide not to build weapons, or they can build weapons. So we'll just make this a binary decision where you either sort of sit tight and you don't build any new weapons, or you decide to add to your current status quo armament by building a weapon. So we'll just say they have a binary choice, don't build or build. And likewise for superpower B, we'll say that superpower B can either not build or build, where not building means that they don't change the status quo at all, and building means that they increase their armaments. So the idea of game theory, the thing that makes game theory, the reason that it's so interesting for international relations and a variety of other settings, is the following. This is it. Write this down. Are you ready? Okay. What makes game theory is that the outcomes are determined, the alternatives for preferences are determined, the inputs of a decision model are determined by multiple players' choices. So up to this point, I could buy a Coke, or I could buy an A&W, or I could buy a lottery ticket. But the bliss that I felt from consuming those depended only on my own decisions. It didn't depend on anybody else's choices. The outcome was determined only by the Coke, or only by the scratch ticket. Here we're saying there are 4 possible outcomes, and those outcomes are pinned down by the choices made by these two superpowers. So before we even start to think about let's just think about this in plain language. There are 4 possibilities, okay? There's the possibility where neither country armed. They both stayed pat. There's also the possibility that they both armed, that they both decided to improve their equipment relative to the status quo. There's also the chance that one of them didn't arm and the other one did, and vice versa, right? So there are 4 possibilities. One where neither armed, one where they both armed, and then there are two different possibilities where one armed and one didn't. Superpower A armed and superpower B didn't, or superpower B armed and superpower A didn't. So those are the outcomes. The outcomes are determined by not just my own choice, not just if I'm superpower A, which is what I call myself most of the time when I'm not on camera. So me, superpower A, it isn't enough to know. You can't tell how happy I am just by my own choice, because presumably I'm not going to dig it very much if I didn't arm, I did nothing, and my potential enemy armed while I was doing nothing. That doesn't sound great. So in other words, there's a lot of wrinkles here. Now, and this is as simple as it gets. It's two countries and it's two alternatives each. But there's a lot of wrinkles here. All right, so let's think about, I'm going to assign some preferences. I'm going to assign some utility numbers. I'm going to assign some happiness numbers to these four contingencies, right? We have four contingencies, and I'm going to assign each one a happiness number for each of the countries, all right? So contingency one, this is probably way too high. So contingency one is the one where neither of them armed. And you're going to say, where do these numbers come from? I'm telling you, I'm assigning numbers. These are my modeling choices. I'm going to assign that outcome for both parties. I'm going to assign that outcome 3 happiness points. All right? And you'll see how these numbers all relate here in a second. Just stay with me. I'm modeling right now. These are my modeling choices. A fable is a construct. I'm the writer of the fable right now. I'm the writer of the arms race fable. And I'm saying that in the world, in the outcome where neither of them builds, it's 3-3. Okay? In the world where both of them build, this is our second contingency. In the second contingency where they both build, I'm going to assign that 2 happiness points for both of them. Why? Well, they're just as evenly matched as they were, and they had to pay some costs to arm. All of that money that they spent on tanks was money that they could have spent on something else. So that's 2-2. The only thing that we know from that 2-2 is that it's strictly worse than the no arm outcome, right? The numbers are arbitrary, right? They're just rankings. So we're saying this one is worse. So the third contingency is the one where superpower A armed and superpower B didn't arm, all right? Now, superpower A is really happy. And the reason that they're happy is, yeah, they paid a cost, but now they're in a newly dominant position, right? They are no longer evenly matched with their potential enemy. They are the winners. They're looking very strong. So they get 4. And superpower B is really angry that they didn't arm. They're like, man, we just let our potential enemy become our much stronger enemy. So they get 1. Finally, there's the other contingency where superpower B armed and superpower A didn't arm. And in that world, it's the same thing in reverse. Superpower A is really unhappy. They get 1. And superpower B is happy. They get 4. So we have these 4 outcomes. We have these 4 possible outcomes where an outcome is determined by both countries' choices. And we see a preference relation defined on those 4 outcomes. They might as well be hearts, clubs, spades, diamonds. Right? We're imbuing this with substantive meaning, but the act of assigning preferences is the same one that you've done up to this point. This is all just as it was. It's just that suddenly they aren't so abstract. Now it means something. We've imbued the model with meaning by telling the story. So what are these inputs? I mean, this is an exhaustive list of all combinations of the country's choices, available choices, right? They could both arm, they could both not arm, they could be one. We need something that tells me what are all these actual outcomes, because in order for me to define a utility function on the outcomes, I need to know what all the outcomes are. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a function. Every dot gets 1 arrow. So I need to know what a dot is. What's an outcome? What constitutes an outcome? And what tool tells me what this is? It's almost like we talked about this one time. I feel like we talked about this. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but I think we talked about this. Exhaustive list of all possible combinations of 2 sets. Did we talk about that? Week 1, Cartesian products. So, wait a second. So we're saying that the set of possible outcomes is a set of all ordered pairs of choices by the 2 players. That's the Cartesian product of their 2 action sets, where their action sets are don't arm or arm, right? Well, okay, so we're about to get somewhere maybe familiar looking. So with a Cartesian product with finite sets like this, I can put that in tabular format. I can make a table of that, right? So I'm going to put country A's, superpower A's decisions this way, whatever, I don't quite know how to say this. And I'm going to put superpower B's decision this way. So I'm going to put don't arm, arm, don't arm, arm. Now I've got 4 cells, and these 4 cells, each of them represents a combination of choices by the 2 superpowers, right? So here in the northwest cell, right? So I'm guessing it's gonna be right there, northwest cell. That's the situation where neither country armed. In the northeast cell, that's the situation where superpower A didn't arm and superpower B did arm. In the southwest cell, that's the situation where country B or superpower A armed and superpower B didn't arm. And then the southeast cell is the cell where they both armed. So now I've got this, those were my 4 rows in that table that I had just built, right? Now I've got this in this nice little matrix. Now, while I'm converting that spreadsheet that we made into this matrix, notice that I can just, there are 4 outcomes. I can put the utility numbers for each country in these cells. I mean, they're cells, they're empty cells. Right now we just see the Cartesian product elements. Those are kind of boring. Let's put in some utilities. In that northwest cell, well, that's the situation where neither of them armed, right? This is good news. So that's 3 for country A and 3 for country B. And the convention is to put the row players number first and the column players number second. It's going to take you a while to get used to that. You be patient with yourself, okay? One thing that in my experience throws a lot of people off is it's just hard to keep track of which number comes first and which number comes second. And you might think that that's like, oh, I'm so stupid, oh, math is so... None of that is true. It's just a convention that takes some time to adjust to. So allow yourself the time to adjust to it. The row player's number comes first, the column player's number comes second, which is to say, if we're making comparisons, the first numbers get compared row-wise, and the second numbers get compared column-wise. You'll get used to it. So there's 3, 3. In that northwest cell, there's 3, 3. Now let's move over to the northeast cell. That's the situation where superpower A didn't arm, they were faithful, but superpower B armed. So superpower A, they're up the creek, they have 1 happiness point. And superpower B, they've got the paddles, they've got 4 happiness points. Nuclear Paddles, oh, what a good band. The Nuclear Paddles is the best band name yet, easily. Down in the southwest cell, well, that's the situation where superpower A armed and superpower B didn't arm. So that means flip those numbers. So 4 for superpower A and 1 for superpower B. Finally, in the southeast cell, both parties armed, both countries armed, and that's the 2, 2. 2 for superpower A and 2 for superpower B. So this is a matrix representation of a game. Now, if I had started from this, there are many classes of this type that would have started with this. This would be hour 1 of day 1. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, these numbers are these numbers and these countries are these countries and their decision-making processes are their decision-making process, and I don't know anything about any of that. This matrix means more. If you've struggled through what is rationality, what is expected utility, what is it to give a superpower an expected utility function, right? Because this matrix is where we're going to be living for a while, is in matrices like this one, all right? But this is nothing more than a quick depiction of a really important fable about arms races. And the act of assigning numbers, which is now so simple and straightforward, we just had to work hard to get to know when we get to do that. So this is a very famous game. It's not just for arms races. This is a very famous game for other reasons. You may have seen a game like this before, but with different labels on the names of the players and different labels on the names of the actions. But it's the same exact game. This game is something called the Prisoner's Dilemma. It is probably the most famous 2x2 game. What do I mean when I say 2x2? I mean there are 2 players, this one, and they each have 2 choices. All right? So 2x2 games are very important in game theory, and they're the simplest possible games. They're straightforward, and some of them have these easy names to remember that help you to relate different states of affairs. So the story of the prisoner's dilemma, the traditional story of the prisoner's dilemma, has precisely nothing to do with arms races. What does the story have to do with? Well, let me change the names of the players and change the names of the actions. So there's two players, call them Prisoner A and Prisoner B. I'll just keep the A and the B where they are. But now they're prisoners rather than superpowers. It's amazing how fast you can do that. You can just convert an entire country and all of their army into a prisoner. And so they're suspects at the moment. And let's change the names of their actions, however. Let's change it from not build and build to stay silent, cooperate, or tattle on your partner, defect on your partner. Okay? And the story of the prisoner's dilemma goes like this. You and I are petty thieves, maybe, and we get caught committing an act of theft. All right? Now, what we were caught doing was relatively minor, but the police suspect that there's a lot more going on in our little two-person cartel of petty theft, where we're just walking around stealing peanut butter M&Ms. That's the theft in this world. So they put us in separate interrogation rooms. The authorities place you and me in separate interrogation room. I'm A, you're B. And they say the following. Well, we have enough to get you on a misdemeanor, so we'll be able to have you pay a fine no matter what. But if you provide incriminating evidence of your other criminal activities about your partner, we'll let you go free, no fine, and your partner will have to go to jail for the rest of their life. It's a game. This is simple. It's not that much less complicated than Law and Order, but it's still pretty bad. So the four outcomes there are, your favorite outcome is the one where you defect and your partner cooperates. They stay silent because then you get to go home and don't pay a fine and they're stuck in jail for the rest of their life. Your second favorite outcome is the one where you both stayed silent, you both cooperated, because then you both have to pay a fine, but that's it. Your third favorite outcome is the one where you both tattled because now you're both in jail for a longer amount of time. And then your least favorite outcome is the one where your partner defected on you and you cooperated because now you're in jail for the rest of your life. So if we worked those out, we would have the same exact rankings. Right? The structure of the game is unchanged. The essential nature of how do two suspects simultaneously make the decision about whether or not to cooperate or defect with one another is similar, is related, is somehow connectable to the question of how two superpowers decide to manage their arms caches. This is why we write down games. We write down games so that I can tell you a memorable fable about two suspects being put in separate interrogation chambers. And now that's in your memory bank. You're going to remember that. Eventually, thanks to lots of practice on your problem sets in the weeks to come, if I ask you to draw a prisoner's dilemma, you're just going to be able to do it. Ding, 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 ding. That doesn't mean anything. All you're doing is writing down symbols. That doesn't mean anything in the absence of imbuing it with meaning. And what I'm saying to you is, the beauty of a game, what makes games so powerful and why they're so useful to us in international relations, is they provide us with a delightful set of fables to keep in our memory banks. And then, as the world unfolds as it is wont to do, we have a better chance of understanding what's happening because we can relate states of affairs much more easily. I can say, that looks like a prisoner's dilemma to me, anytime I see something that happens to look like a prisoner's dilemma to me. That's the way to see it. I'm not trying to understand prisoners, necessarily. I'm not trying to understand superpowers, necessarily. It's great that I do. It's great that I can use this one tool to understand both of those things, but the art of crafting a fable is about more than whatever it is that you're talking about directly at the moment. So this is the prisoner's dilemma. It's probably the most famous of the 2x2 fables. It comes up in international relations for reasons of arms races. It comes up in any time that public good provision comes up. We'll spend some separate time on public good provision, but so a public good is a good that it's non-excludable and non-rival. So what that means is I'm not able to stop somebody else from consuming it. If I own the public good, say, or if I'm an enjoyer of the public good, I can't stop somebody from consuming it. And my consumption of the public good doesn't hinder somebody else's, right? So the idea here is that something like security is a public good. Why? Well, if the world is secure, if we live in a secure place, well, I can't very well say, sorry, those of you not interested in security must go over there, or something like that. I mean, and other than we live in a walled city in some dystopian novel, security is something that I can't stop somebody else from enjoying. Clean air, I can't stop you from enjoying clean air. Just breathe. You're breathing, I can't stop you. Not without committing a serious crime, which I have no interest in committing, right? And what the rival condition gets us is the fact that if I consume it, that doesn't stop you from consuming it. So there's plenty of clean air. So my breathing doesn't appreciably slow down how much oxygen is clean in the air. So my consumption of clean air doesn't influence your consumption of clean air. My consumption of security doesn't influence your consumption of security. So public goods, that's a public good. And the idea here is that the cooperate outcome represents we both pitch in to pay for a public good that we get to enjoy, and if you may have noticed, generate a Pareto efficient outcome. And it turns out that the prisoner's dilemma is a wonderful way to model this. And we'll talk about how to analyze it from various angles, but analyzing the game is very different from just seeing the game and telling the story. The story is different from the punchline. The punchline is not the same as the joke. Just to show you that this is related to what we've been talking about, so here I'll just throw on the screen, I'll show you that I could just as easily have written this out with preference relations, right? So instead of this matrix representation of the prisoner's dilemma, I could have just said, here are the different preference relations, and then you may have said, okay, and let's think about how to find the set of maximal elements with respect to that preference relation, but it's just easier to look at this matrix, right? But they capture the same thing. Similarly, let me just throw this into utility imputation space instead of this matrix. So here I've got superpower A's or prisoner A's utility on the horizontal axis, and I've got B's utility on the vertical axis. Well, I've got 4 outcomes I need to inject into this utility imputation space. Right, so I've got 1-4 and 4-1. Those are the 2 asymmetric outcomes. And then I've got the more symmetric and egalitarian 2-2 and 3-3. Those were for cooperate, and defect. And look, I mean, you can see we've got a Pareto frontier. We see that the cooperate, Pareto dominates the defect, but that the other 2 asymmetric outcomes are also Pareto efficient. Right, so this is all we could tell this story from all the different angles that we've talked about up to this point. It's just that this matrix is a little bit easier to work with. It's easier to tell the stories. It's easier to just write it down real fast if you need to. So what matters is the story. The game, how you depict the game, you could do it in symbols, you could do it in utility imputations, you could do it in a matrix. None of those is a game. Those are just different ways of seeing a game. But what the game is much deeper. So what's a game? What makes a game, and how would I be able to tell one game from another game? So we need a formal definition of a game. And this is I hope that this is a moment that really drives home how important this fable idea is, because a game is 3 things, all of which are what you need to tell a good story. So a game is a list of 3 things. 1, there's a set of players. We'll call it N. So in the version of in the arms race version, the players were superpower A and superpower B. In the suspect version, it's suspect A and suspect B. In a 3-player game, maybe the players are you, me, and my dog Chewy. We could have 4 players, 5 players, ... N players. We could have an infinite number of players if we wanted to, but it's not very interesting. At least at the level that we'll be talking about. But in general, we begin from, hey, who are the players? And in game theory, we call them players. All right? So who are the players of the game? In fable terms, who are the dramatis personae? Right? You open up a play. Let me find a play. So here's one of my favorite plays. Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. And look, I mean, so we've got a title page, and then we've got the copyright information. Sorry, you probably can't hear me over that. We've got the copyright information, and then look, who are the people? Who are the people? Who are the people? Who are the players? Who are the people? Well, the people are, in this play, it's a short list of dramatis personae. Estragon, Vladimir, Lucky, Pozzo, and a boy. If you haven't seen Waiting for Godot, it's good. It's a little heavy. It's a little heavy, but it's also very funny. Hence the name Tragicomedy. Every story needs its players. All the world's a stage, etc., etc. So, element one of a game is a set of players. You need to know what labels to attach. What is the indexing set for what's to come? So we're going to use these players as indexing sets for two other things. One, for every player, we're going to have a set of actions called capital A sub I. Right? So in the last example, A sub superpower A was don't arm or arm, and A sub superpower B was don't arm or arm. In the traditional version of the prisoner's dilemma, A sub suspect A is cooperate or defect, and A sub suspect B is cooperate or defect. Now, in both of these examples, it just so happens that the two players had the same exact action sets. That won't be the case. You'll see some examples where that isn't the case moving forward. Chewie says hi. So we need that. A sub I. So we have a set of all players, and then for every player, we have a set of available actions. So now we've got who are the players and what can they do? Who are the people and what can they do? This sounds an awful lot like the beginning of a good story. And then the last question is, what do they want? What do they like? What are their motivations? What are their preferences? And so what we need to do is come up with a set of all possible action profiles. I'll say strategy profiles pretty often too, I'm sure. The set of all lists: cooperate, 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 defect, defect, cooperate, defect, defect. Arm, arm, don't arm, don't arm. Don't arm, arm, don't arm. That's that Cartesian product that we were talking about. So we need a Cartesian product over everybody's available actions. And that is basically the set of all possible outcomes. Right? So I've got the set of all possible outcomes, which is just the Cartesian product of every player's action set. Okay? It's almost like there was a plan when I was teaching you some of that week one stuff. And that's going to be the input of our utility function. So every player I, has a U sub I, a utility function that reads in these outcomes. It reads in this big Cartesian product. It reads in that set of 4 elements. And it spits out happiness numbers. 4, 3, 2, 1. U of CC equals 3. U of DC equals 1, etc. So that's a game. That's a game. That's all that a game is. The rest is details. This is a game. This is what makes a game a game. If I gave you this list, you could make a matrix, you could make a preference doodle, you could make a utility imputation doodle, whatever other interesting creative ways of presenting a game you could think of, you could do it. This list has everything you need. This list of the set of players, the set of available actions for every player, and the preferences over outcomes for every player, that's all that you need. The rest is details. Now, as we enrich game theory, as we enrich our theory of game theoretic international relations, as we add nuance, as we add wrinkles, then we will modify, amend, enrich, whatever you want to say. We will adjust our setup accordingly, but no adjustment that we will make is more important than this. This is the foundation of everything that we will do moving forward. These 3 things will always be present. If you ever find yourself confused, ask yourself, who are the players, what can they do, and what do they want? Because those 3 things will be present every time moving forward. Every fable has those 3 things. So when I write out this full list version, when I write out a formal definition of a game, it's a very rare thing. You're not going to do that most of the time. Most of the time we're going to say those will be introduced informally or in a more written style rather than a here's what a game is computer. But At random intervals, when you feel a little bit confused, or you're like, oh, there's a lot of indexicality ruining my mojo right now, just write out this list. Write out these 3 things. If you know these 3 things for any given game, then you're halfway there. The rest is details. So we'll have plenty of chances to hone our prisoner's dilemma type intuitions, and we'll talk about it quite a bit in the C block as well when we discuss dominance. So I don't want to stay here for too long because we're going to be talking about the prisoner's dilemma quite a bit moving forward. But I just want to make sure that you see that this is a simple instantiation of a game. When I write out that matrix that everybody can draw from memory if they take in a class like this, that gives you a list, and vice versa. It's just that the matrix is a little bit easier to work with, but none of that is what a game is, right? A game is the game is when I was saying to you, consider 2 countries. And here's what they can do. They can arm or they cannot arm, right? These are stories. I'm trying to tell you a story. I'm trying to tell you a fable. None of this is the act of science just yet. I'm just telling you a story, all right? And an interesting question is, well, what other stories are out there? Are there any other interesting stories that are worth having in my little toolkit of 2x2 games, my little fables to say, anytime I see something, does that remind me of a fable that I know? Well, let's work on our lexicon. See you in the B block. So here in the B block, I just want to run through a couple more games that come up a lot in the international relations theory literature, just to give you a sense about what this looks like in broad brushstrokes. So we've discussed one. We discussed the prisoner's dilemma, which you're going to be so good at dinner parties now because everybody at dinner parties likes to talk about the prisoner's dilemma. It's the 2x2 game that if somebody has heard of a 2x2 game, they've heard of the prisoner's dilemma. And it's a good question why that is. And part of that is because of its substantive punchline, which we'll get to in the C block. But part of it is also that it's a compelling and interesting fable. Like, the story is just an interesting story to tell. Not all the games that I'm going to show you here in the B block are going to have a similar flavor. They're not all going to be quite as interesting as the prisoner's dilemma. Some of them are and some of them aren't. But these are just tools that you can use. You can look at any given situation between two parties or 2 countries or however you want to put it. You can think about these things using some of these other fables. So there's 4 more fables that I'd like to show you. By the end of this lecture, I want you to have a sense about 5 fables, Prisoner's Dilemma and 4 others. So the next one I want to talk about is similar to the Prisoner's Dilemma. It's called the assurance game. And this plays a big role in the security dilemma literature. We'll work on this on your problem set. So the assurance game is similar to the prisoner's dilemma in the following sense. There's 2 countries, we'll call them A and B. And they can either do a cooperative thing or a defecty thing, right? So I'm gonna be broad about this in a moment. You can think about this as arm and not arm, be aggressive or not be aggressive, however you want to put it. It's just that something is cooperative-y and another thing is defecty. The underlying logic of the assurance game is different from the underlying logic of the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, you'll see that there's a very strong incentive for everybody to be very nasty to one another. The underlying idea of the assurance game is that if you want peace, if you want to succeed in international relations, you basically have 2 ways to go about it. You can not poke the bear, you can cooperate and hope that induces cooperation by other people. Or you can compete. You can be a jerk, you can throw your weight around and understand that that means that other countries might as well, and then you can try to win that game. So there's 2 paths to success in international relations, goes the logic of the assurance game. All right? We'll run this on the screen. Now we've got a 2x2 matrix. That's just a Cartesian product of these cooperate, defect outcomes, yeah? So we've again got 4 cells. Okay, so in the northwest cell, that's the one where they both did the cooperative thing. And we're going to say that that's the very best. This is sort of a liberal outcome where if we all manage to not meddle in each other's affairs, then something mutually beneficial happens and we get this wonderful outcome, and we encode a wonderful outcome with 4 happiness points. 4 happiness points for country A and 4 happiness points for country B. So this is part of what makes it different from a prisoner's dilemma, is the favorite outcome in the assurance game is the one where everybody cooperates. It's not the one where you get to sit at home and play video games while your partner is in jail for the rest of their life. So the second best outcome is the one where you defected and your opponent cooperated, right? So I'm going to assign 3 happiness points for the role player in the southwest column. And likewise, I'm going to assign country B 3 happiness points in the northeast column. So your second favorite outcome in the insurance game is to be the jerk when your opponent wasn't the jerk. Next is the southeast cornered outcome where you both were jerks. You both defected. So that'll be 2-2. And then finally, the least favorite outcome is the one where you cooperated and the other person defected, just like before. So that means that in the southwest corner, that's 1 happiness point for country A. And in the northeast corner, that's 1 happiness point for country B. So let me just highlight that even though this game looks very similar, 2 countries, cooperate, defect, it's different. Why is it different? Because we assign different utility numbers to the 2 outcomes. So I'll just put both the matrices on the screen, or we could put different utility imputation doodles on the screen. They're similar but not the same. Now suddenly, so in Prisoner's Dilemma land, there were 3 different elements of the Pareto frontier. In Assurance Game land, there's a single element. Cooperate is the unique Pareto efficient outcome. But there's a similar flavor in the sense that there's this scary outcome where we both defect on one another that's Pareto dominated by the good outcome where we both cooperate. It's just that what these 2 games represent are 2 different ways of thinking through. Do you prefer the cooperative outcome? Or do you prefer the asymmetric outcome where you were a jerk and your partner wasn't and you get to reap all those benefits? Now, which game is more appropriate for any given case of international relations depends. But it depends squarely on that difference. And now that you have these 2 different games that look identical except for this one little difference, any differences in these 2 games after we've analyzed them, that gives you a really powerful set of tools for thinking about now you've got 2 similar but different ways of thinking about something similar seeming. There's a similar flavor in these 2 models, but you can imagine very different outcome in the 2 worlds. That's cool. That's really cool if you ask me. So the assurance game, its most famous application in international relations is probably to Robert Jervis's concept of the security dilemma. There was a well-known paper, I forget if it's 78 or 79 off the top of my head. In the late 70s, Robert Jervis, a well-known international relations theorist, wrote a good paper in World Politics, sort of a broad comparative IR journal where there's a lot of high-minded stuff that happens there. And he wrote down a very simple 2x2 game toward the end, thinking about spirals of nasty behavior. I'll post it on Piazza. And this assurance game, if you understand this assurance game, then you understand that a lot of the nuances of Jervis's formal argument, not his informal argument. The fights about which utility numbers ought to go where, that takes pages and pages and pages of scholarly arguing, right? But that's what's so fun. So let me show you another game. It's called the coordination game. This is one of the simplest and most straightforward games. It's a very good introductory game. And the idea is the following. There are 2 parties, call them A and B. They can both be countries, they could be drivers on the road. So the idea here is simplest if we say, I'm a driver and you're a driver. We are 2 drivers, we're separate drivers. And we have to decide what side of the road to drive on. We're going in opposite directions on University Avenue. Okay, I'm going west and you're going east. If we both drive on what we view as the right side of the road, like somebody would under the current laws, right? If that's the case, then we don't hit one another, and that's great because we get to go where we're going. I'm at Culver's now. I'm very happy, right? So we drive past one another, no crashes, and let's say that's worth a happiness point. If we both drive on the right side of the road, that's worth a happiness point. But if we were living in England and I had to get to the English version of Culver's, right, and we both drove on the left side of the road, as they do in England, then that would have been fine too. We wouldn't have hit one another. There's nothing special about the right side of the road. That's the law here, so we drive on the right side of the road. But There are other places that have the left side of the road where they drive, and that's fine too. The problem is, if I drive on what looks like the right side of the road to me, and you drive on what looks like the left side of the road to you, now we're in the same lane, going different directions. Now we're in a fiery car crash. That's not good. All I wanted was a cheeseburger and some custard, and now I'm in a car crash. This is bad. 0 happiness points. Likewise, if I drive on the left and you drive on the right. So, this game is super simple because there's 2 outcomes essentially. There's 4 outcomes, left, left, right, right, left, right, and right, left. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is that there's 2 qualitative outcomes. There's 2 kinds of outcomes. There's 2 classes of outcomes. I can partition the outcome set into 2 subsets. One where we don't crash and one where we do. Left, left, and right, right, those both lead to 1 happiness point because getting where you're going is worth 1. And left, right, and right, left both yield 0 happiness points because being in a car crash is worth 0. It's worse. 1 unit, 2 unit, Googleplex units, it doesn't matter. So I can put that into a matrix. The row player can go left or right, column player can go left or right. And if we manage to keep ourselves on the main diagonal, right? If it's right, left, left, or right, right, then that's 1, 1. But if we get off the main diagonal, if we're like this, then 0, 0. So that's a coordination game. Why is this interesting? Well, we'll talk about this a little bit next week when we talk about Nash equilibrium. What's interesting about this is there's nothing special about the left side of the road or the right side of the road. There's nothing special. I mean, I guess you could try to make an argument that most people are right-handed. And so it's better if they're driving with their, I don't know what the argument would look like. It's better if they're driving with their outside arm. So maybe driving on the right side of the road is better because that plays better to the fact that most people are right-handed. But we are tap dancing. That is a weak argument. That's flimsy. Relative to, we just don't want to crash into one another. That's why there's a law for this. There are people who are watching you. We call them surveillors. They watch to make sure that you're driving on the correct side of the road based on the laws. But if there was no law, if we were living in anarchy, if there was no state, you would have no way to say what side of the road you ought to drive on because you don't have any expectations about how other people are going to drive. So when you go drive, or when I go drive, let's say you're driving 35 miles an hour on a regular residential road. That's a reasonable speed. That's not a super high speed. Those of us that have driven faster than 35 miles per hour. Nevertheless, a head-on collision at 35 miles an hour, if I'm going 35 and you're going 35, if we're both going 35 head-on, that's more than enough to do a lot of damage. The fact that we can drive 35 miles an hour on a residential road and have relatively reasonable and legitimate expectations that we're not going to be involved in a head-on collision at that speed is magic. How do we do that? How do we know how other people are going to drive? Well, we have a state to tell us what side to drive on. Why do we need that? You'll learn next week. You'll be like, I thought I was going to be learning about real things, and I'm like, what's more real than not being in a head-on crash while you're driving 35 miles an hour? That's a relatively small decision, coordinating on driving on the right side of the road. What about if a bunch of different countries had to coordinate on a given set of protocols for a trade deal? What if they had to coordinate on all making yogurt the same way so that they were able to engage in good competition? The bargaining of food politics, like the food institutions, are really nasty. What if we had to coordinate on setting our financial policies together, right? So if the United States and the United Kingdom set monetary policies that weren't well suited to one another, this would have disastrous consequences for both their own economies and for other economies that are related to the two currencies. They need to coordinate, right? They need to make sure that they're responding to one another well. There's a coordination act going on there. This is a very different fable than the other two fables. These fables capture different strategic situations. They're applicable to different strategic situations, but the fable is the fable. Monetary policy, driving on the road, it doesn't matter. The fable is what relates states of affairs to one another. That's the thing that lets you know, one IR thing versus another IR thing. But also, two, one IR thing versus an everyday experience that you can reliably express to somebody else, be it a student when you're talking into a can, or some friend that you're talking to at a dinner party, or the president if you're some advisor. You have to be able to relate states of affairs to one another. This is how you do it. You do it by talking about 35 miles an hour on a residential road. These games, these fables, they're so powerful. The Book of Fables has so much insight in it. What if we decided that we were going to be in an arms network together? We're in like NATO or something. And so it's important that we're able to supply each other with weapons and replacement parts. If you don't provide replacement parts to somebody that you sold weapons to, then you might as well not sell them the weapons. Well, what if my replacement parts were in millimeters and yours were in inches? That's bad! That's bad! That makes it hard for us to have an awesome cadre of army together. That wasn't a great sentence, but I'm just going to keep it. How do we coordinate? What's a coordination problem? This is a coordination problem. All right, let's talk about taking it to the brink. Let's talk about what happens if you want to push your enemy to the limit, but there's such a thing as it too far. Let's talk about the game of chicken. In one of the books that I was using while I was thinking about teaching you these games, a footnote for the name of the game of chicken was, the name of the game of chicken comes from California dare rituals, which is not a sentence that you get to read all that often. But the story comes from a movie called Rebel Without a Cause from the 1950s. James Dean was in it. It's about sort of restless youths trying to make the best in a difficult world. It's a pretty timeless story. So the idea here, let's say that you've got two people that want to demonstrate that they're cool, and they're involved in a dare ritual. So they get into two cars and they point the cars at one another from a long. They get on a road. They get on University Avenue and they point their cars at one another. And they start driving at high speed. This is a smart thing to do. This is a great way for you to make decisions in your everyday life. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so they're going at high speed, and the game of chicken is like this: whoever swerves first is the loser of the contest. They're the chicken. Right, so the way that you demonstrate your awesomeness in this game is to keep on driving and to make your opponent swerve first, and then that's the chicken, and you're the winner. You look very awesome now, even though you probably peed your pants like 2 drops. Now, if you both swerve, if they swerve simultaneously, then they're both the chicken. It's like a tie, and hopefully they don't decide to hit reset like in rock, paper, scissors. Hopefully there's no do-overs, or no 2 out of 3. So that's comparatively good, but it's not as good as winning, but it's better than being the chicken and it's better than losing. And then the worst thing of all is if neither of you swerves and there's a car crash. A lot of the stories, I remarked this to my other class when we were talking about games last week, just too many of these games involve potential for car crashes. So chicken is a model of brinkmanship. I want to push you. If we're thinking about fighting a war together, I want to keep pushing. I want to push. I want to keep driving my car toward you. I want to make you swerve. Right? I want to win this competition. I want to win this bargaining process. I want to win this negotiation. I want to win this tax deal. I'm going to push. I'm going to make you swerve. I'm going to make you swerve until I see that you're still coming at me and finally I swerve. I hope I swerve. So how do we encode the game of chicken? We've got 2 players, call them A and B. James Dean and some supporting actor. I should figure out who the other actor is. And so they can either swerve or go straight. So in this northwest corner, we both swerved, right? So that's the one where neither of us won, but neither of us lost. We'll call that 1-1. Now let's keep me swerving and you go straight. You're in the northeastern cell. I get 0 points because I'm the chicken, and you get 2 because you're so awesome. You won the contest of awesomeness. Similarly, if I went to the southwestern corner, well then I went straight and you swerved, so I win. I get 2 points, and you're the chicken. You get 0 points. And then rather tragically, in the southeast corner, if neither of us swerves, if we both go straight, then we crash into one another, and that's -1 for being in a bad car crash. Presumably faster than 35 miles an hour. So this is the model of chicken. So chicken is really good for a crisis, right? So people have used chicken to understand nuclear crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis was rather famously compared to a game of chicken by a lot of commentators, including the aforementioned Thomas Schelling. An interesting question is, how do you win the game of chicken? This is an aside. So let's say that we're playing chicken. You and me are playing chicken. We're in cars. You're in your really awesome, fast, big car, and I'm in my little Subaru. We're driving toward one another. What's the best way to win chicken? What could I do to make sure that I won the game of chicken? Well, you might talk a lot. You might act really tough. You might, you might do something. Oh God, tell me that doesn't look stupid. You might do something really signally. You might try to send signals that you are really committed to driving. But once we start driving, you don't know what's happening in my bladder. You don't know. All I did was act tough when it was easy to act tough. The way that you win chicken isn't to act tough before you start driving. It's to get rid of your steering wheel. The way that you win chicken is to tie your own hands. I would get into the car with my hands tied behind my back and just hit the accelerator, and I would win the game of chicken. Why? Well, you know that I'm not going to be able to. You know I'm not going to swerve because my hands are tied behind my back. Or I chop the steering wheel off of my little Subaru. There's no way I'm going to swerve, so you better swerve. That's how you win chicken. You win chicken by tying your hands. That's weird, right? That's weird. We'll talk about this quite a bit. That's one of those insights. That's one of those things. So I've asked people about this before. Or if somebody asks me what I do, and I'm like, I don't know. But if they ask me what I do, chicken will come up eventually. Because I think chicken is a really interesting and fun game. And it's partially because everybody wants to think that if you learn game theory, then that means that you're going to know how to beat everybody at everything. And my chess rating indicates otherwise. But one interesting thing is when people ask you, how do you win chicken? Because people think that game theorists know how to win things. That's one interesting answer. That's the coolest answer. That's the way that you win chicken is to chop the steering wheel off of your car, or to tie your hands behind your back, to really constrain yourself into commitment. That's heavy. All right, last game. I owe you one more game. Matching pennies. So matching pennies is really useful for thinking about tactics. And so the idea is the following. You and I are involved in a coin tossing game. So we both have a penny. This is still from Expected Utility Week. So we both have a penny, and we toss our pennies, and we hide them. And the idea is the following. If both of the pennies are heads or tails, then I get to keep them. And if it's one tails, one heads, then you get to keep them. So I want them to match, and you want them to not match. Hence the name Matching Pennies. And so this is a zero-sum game. You'll see why in a moment. It is a very interesting zero-sum game. So there's two players, and there's two possibilities. It's not a strategy so much, but my coin could be heads or tails, and your coin could be heads or tails. All right? And so I'm the one that wants them to be the same. So on the main diagonal, I get one happiness point because I get an extra penny. Right? And off the main diagonal, I get -1 happiness points because you take my penny. Because you win then. And the exact opposite for you. So on the main diagonal, you get -1 because they matched, and so I get to keep them. And then off the main diagonal, ones where they're different, then you get 1 because you get to keep them. So this is matching pennies. Matching pennies is really useful for like offense and defense. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm playing offense, if I'm an attacking army, if I'm an invading army, and I'm more powerful, then I would like for us to show up at the same battlefield, and I'm ready to roll, and I'm going to attack. And you don't want that. You're a guerrilla fighter, and you only want to fight when we aren't on the same field. You want to catch me unawares. So I want to coordinate. I want us to pick a day and time and show up and have a big old fight. And you don't want to coordinate. You never want us to be on an empty battlefield together. You want to fight when we're not together. So I want to coordinate. I want heads, heads, or tails, tails. I don't really care which side of the coin. I just want to beat you up on some battlefield because I'm the strong army and you're the guerrilla fighter. You want heads, tails, or tails, heads. So the idea of choosing where to put your forces, That actually has a lot of matching pennies logic to it. So now we have 5 games. We have 5 games under our fingers. We have the prisoner's dilemma, we have the assurance game, we have a coordination game, we have chicken, and we have matching pennies. That doesn't exhaust all the possibilities, but these 5 are very useful for international relations. And if you can understand these 5 games, not their analysis, not their outcomes, not anything like that, just the underlying fable. If you can understand the underlying fable of these 5 games, then I'm happy. Like we're going to talk about a lot more, but frankly speaking, if you understand what a game is, what makes a game, why they're different, and how they can help us to relate different states of affairs, and if you know enough games to be able to relate states of affairs, and I think these 5 really matter for that, then I would consider it a major success. If this problem set is something that you can work through, maybe not the first week, if you can understand this problem set by the end of this class, I'll be very happy. Because that's what we're here to do. We're here to know what a game is, to know what rationality is, etc. But we also want to be able to relate different states of affairs. We want to be able to say, that looks like chicken to me. I want to be able to read the newspaper and say, that looks like the assurance game to me. That looks like a prisoner's dilemma to me. I can understand this as the matching pennies phenomenon, and so on. It's so tempting to just want to get to the ending of these things so quickly. It's tempting to say, and tell me what your prediction is, and we're going to get to that. But these fables, they're just so much more useful than just a way to make sausage, a way to spit out predictions. There's more to it than that. These are cool stories. And these stories are very applicable stories. They're our modern day book of fables. That said, we do need to figure out how to analyze a model. How do we take this Cartesian product? So as of right now, there are 4 outcomes in each of these games. If we had more players and more available options, then there would be more possible outcomes. So for example, if I had 3 choices and you had 3 choices, instead of just 2, then there would be 9 possible outcomes. If there were 3 of us, each with a binary choice, so 3 countries are voting in the United Nations, vote yay or vote nay, then there's 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8 possible outcomes. If it's 5 countries, each with 10 choices, there are 50 possible outcomes, 5 times 10. So depending on how you write the game down, there's a lot of different outcomes. And it's natural to wonder, well, which of these outcomes do we think is going to happen? Which of these choices do we think are going to be made? When do they choose to arm? When do they choose to not arm? When do they swerve? When do they not swerve? Under what conditions? How does this all work together? And so the fable in its own right is an end in itself. And so this B block is an end in itself. We are done. Understand the fables. Know them for what they are. Appreciate their essential nature. But they're also a means to an end. And the act of whittling it down from 4 possibilities to 1 predicted outcome or 2 predicted outcomes, just narrowing it down, that's really important. Now that's what Nash equilibrium is all about, and that's what all these other amendments to game theory are. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But before we get to that, I want to introduce one important concept that relates to the structure of games and doesn't quite put all of the focus on the prediction aspect. So I want to talk about dominance, and we're going to talk about that in the C block. So let's go to the C block. So I want to talk about strict dominance. What is strict dominance and how does it help us to sort of reduce a game to its interesting parts? So the idea of dominance is the following. It relies on an important and hidden assumption in game theory. So in game theory, we gave all the parties utility functions, and so we're assuming that there's individual level rationality about the outcomes, where the outcomes are all the possible combinations of choices. That's all as it was before. If my outcome set was just all the combinations of choices, I can draw a preference doodle, I can draw a utility imputation doodle, there's all sorts of different ways to see it that are in keeping with what we've done up to this point. But there's another assumption that has to be discussed. So it's not just that we're rational and that we know the terms of the game, right? So the players see the game, right? So I'm superpower A, and somebody has handed me a scrap of paper with these weird symbols on it and says, choose. That's strange, but that's kind of what we're saying happens in the fable. But there's an important aspect that's on the social level, that isn't just individual level, and it's the social assumption of common knowledge. So not only is it true that I am rational and know the game, prisoner's dilemma, chicken, assurance, whatever. Not only is that true, but you know that that's true. You know that I'm rational and know the game. And I know that you know that I'm rational and know the game. And you know that I know that you know that I'm rational and know the game. And I know that you know that you know that I 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 know that you know I lost it. That I'm rational and know the game. So not only is my knowledge of rationality and knowing the game common knowledge, the fact that you know is common knowledge. The fact that you know that I know that. You can make behavioral assumptions about me as another player embedded in a game. And we're going to leverage that. We're going to take advantage of the fact that not only are we both rational, but we're both rational and our rationality is common knowledge. All right? So dominance leverages this by saying, well, let's see if we can find strategies, actions. Let's see if we can find an action for any given player that is so bad relative to some other action that they could have taken that neither the analyst nor the other players in the game have to take that action seriously. So for example, let's consider the prisoner's dilemma. Isn't it great just to be able to say, oh, just consider a prisoner's dilemma? I mean, the fables there just make it easier to introduce more concepts. Now look, let's think about role player. Observe that if role player knew that column player was going to cooperate, so we're only looking at this cooperate column right now. If the role player knew that, then they could either cooperate and get 3 or defect and get 4. Well, 4 beats 3. So conditional on cooperate, conditional on knowing, once we only focused our attention on the cooperate column, we notice that within that column, defect beats cooperate for role player. Well, let's move over to the other column. Notice that in the defect column, role player could either cooperate and get 1, they're in jail for the rest of their life, or they could defect and get 2. Well, conditional on defect, 2 is higher than 1, they would rather defect. So notice now that irrespective of what column player does, it is strictly better for role player to defect. So I said conditional on cooperate and conditional on defect, but actually it turns out that defect beats cooperate for role player unconditionally. No matter what column player does, defecting is better for role player. That's the definition of strict dominance. Strict dominance is no matter what everybody else does, whether it's one opponent or many, no matter what anybody else does, one of your available choices is always better, strictly so, than another of your available choices. 4 beats 3, 2 beats 1. So if I'm role player and I'm thinking about how to play this game, I don't have to think very hard, because it's not like I have to, okay, let's say that there were 2 people that were making the choice for party A, and let's imagine that they go to some secret chamber. Now they're off in a secret chamber. We're watching Survivor or something, and now they're having a secret conversation. Very secret. They're like, what are we gonna do? I don't know what we're gonna do. Well, if column player cooperates, then we ought to defect. But if column player defects, then we ought to defect. And then they'd cut to commercial. Because it seemed like a high suspense moment. And then after we got back from commercial, then we would say, oh, wait a second, we should just defect. We should just defect. We don't have to, why are we thinking about this? Why are we talking about this? You shouldn't be talking, just defect. It's strictly dominant. It's defecting strictly dominates cooperating for role player. Defecting strictly dominates cooperating for role player. So strict dominance is something that happens between 2 actions for a given player. And here we're saying that one of role player's actions, defect, strictly dominates another of role player's actions, cooperate. So this is one of those things, it's kind of like preferences. It doesn't make any sense to say, I prefer a cheeseburger. You have to say what you prefer it to. Likewise here. You can't just say it's dominated. Dominated by what? So here, defect strictly, we should not have to consider it cooperate for role player, because for role player, defect strictly dominates cooperate. Likewise for column player, Notice that if column player knew that we were in the top row, where row player is cooperating, well, you could either cooperate and get 3 or defect and get 4. And if we knew that we were in the bottom row, where row player is defecting, well, then you could either cooperate and get 1 or defect and get 2. You'd rather defect. So no matter what row player does, column player wants to defect. From a rationality standpoint, given that I know the game and its structure, and you know the game and its structure, and we both know that each other knows the game and its structure, nobody should ever spend any time thinking about what would happen in a dominated row or column. It doesn't make any sense. If I knew that you didn't have to think about it, you would just defect, then why would I think about what happens if you cooperate? I shouldn't have to think about it. So I'm going to eliminate the cooperate row, and I'm going to eliminate the cooperate column. I'm allowed to eliminate strictly dominated strategies. Any game that you see, any game that you see moving forward, any game over the next 10 weeks that we spend together. Oh God, you have 10 more weeks of me, I'm so sorry. But any game over the next 10 weeks, if you see a strategy that is strictly dominated, eliminate it. We eliminate strictly dominated strategies. We don't study them. We don't study them. It's not interesting. There's no tension. There's no intrigue. There is no prediction that I could generate as a rationalist that would involve putting any positive probability on any strictly dominated action. Because any time that you chose something strictly dominated, be it all the time or some of the time, then you could have done better with another action. By definition, any time that you had thought about cooperating, or if you cooperated 15% of the time, say, you're like, oh, I'm going to cooperate 15% of the time. Well, 15% of the time you could have done better by defecting then. So we don't spend time studying them. We eliminate them. So we anytime you see a strictly dominated strategy, zoom, zoom, chop it off. Just eliminate it. Don't study it. It's a waste of your time. So notice that after we've done this elimination of these 2 strictly dominated strategies, zoom, zoom, we just got rid of 3 of the 4 possibilities. And here's the tragic punchline of the prisoner's dilemma. This is the first time you're going to hear it. We might hear it a couple more different ways. They both defect. There's a unique prediction in this model. We went from 4 possibilities to 1 possibility, and in that 1 possibility, it's the bad one. What do I mean bad? Well, substantively, it's a sad story if they both defected, if they both armed, if neither of them pitched into a public good. That's a sad story on a narrative level. It's also a sad story in terms of Pareto optimality. Notice that the defect outcome is Pareto dominated by the cooperate outcome. If we were a social planner, then there would be no ambiguity about moving defect to cooperate. It's strictly better for both parties. But it's not our prediction. Let me repeat that. You might just be sitting there like this right now. This is important. Listen. One of the outcomes, Pareto dominates the other, but the dominated outcome is the unique prediction of this model. It would be better for everybody if we could cooperate, but because of the structure of this game, because of the structure of the incentives, because of what the cops did when they put us in the separate interrogation rooms, or whatever anarchy did to put these 2 superpowers in 2 separate interrogation rooms, whether it's by design or just by the way that things play out, the structure of incentives just created what's called a collective action problem. We would both do better if we cooperated, but our individual incentives aren't there. This is a huge deal. And the prisoner's dilemma is repugnant. It's a sad story. Why is it a sad story? Because we could have had 1 more happiness point, where we don't know what that means. That could mean so much. Go back to the other video. Listen to me shout at you for a while. Some of you didn't finish the video. You're like, when did he shout? It's a sad story. By eliminating these strictly dominated strategies, we came up with a unique prediction, and that unique prediction is sad. That means public goods don't get provided. That means arms races happen. That means prisoners have to spend more time in jail. We were wasteful. The people in this game were wasteful. Why were they wasteful? Because they were selfish, and the structure of the model was such that selfishness crystallized itself in this mutual defection. Dominance. Dominance got us that. We don't have to bring up equilibrium. The most compelling answer to In a game, the most compelling thing is to say, you never play a dominated strategy. That's just silly to play a dominated strategy, and it's silly to analyze a dominated strategy. So let's get rid of the dominated strategies, and oh crap! You know, a lot of the stories that I have to tell you are sad stories, because IR is oftentimes a sad place. The stakes are very high. These collective action problems are a real problem. And that's not unique to IR, for the record. You know, once you get used to seeing collective action problems, then you can't stop seeing them. Notice that this common knowledge, the nestedness thing, the nestedness of I know that you know that I know that you know, and you know that I know that you know that I know, that nestedness actually allows us to repeat this procedure if we want to. So I'm going to flash boring, I'm going to put a fable on the screen. I'm going to put a game on the screen that's 2 players but each has 3 actions. I'm just going to put this on the screen so that I can show you a useful procedure, but this isn't an interesting story. It's just a cleverly constructed story. Cleverly constructed. So you'll notice that we've got a row player. They can go up, middle, or down. And we've got a column player. They can go left, center, or right. Okay? And here's some preference numbers that live in there. Cleverly constructed. Now the idea here is that you'll notice that row player doesn't have any strategies that are strictly dominated by any other of their strategies. I'll put some arrows on the screen, and then I'll help you to see that there's always some, okay, if you went up, then it goes down. There's always some, it depends, for row player. For column player, however, you'll notice that the center column is strictly dominated by the right column. So we don't have to consider it. We can just, we can eliminate it. Because we as analysts then are saying, well, I know the column player will never consider the C column. More importantly, row player knows that column player will never consider the C column. So row player doesn't need to think about it either. Row player knows that column player knows that row player knows that column player knows ... And column player knows that row player knows that column player knows that row player knows ... So we can just chop that off. We don't care, column player doesn't care, row player doesn't care. We're not going to spend any time in that column, so why are we... Get it out of here. All it can do is confuse us. And you're like, I was confused anyway. So was I, my friend. So was I. Still am. Well, now look. We have this simplified game. We went from 3 by 3 to 3 by 2. But notice now, in this new, simpler world, row player U strictly dominates both M and D. Because row player knows that column player isn't going to use the center column, in this simpler world that doesn't include the center column, row player has a strictly dominant strategy. Now you're like, but it wasn't strictly dominant before. Yeah, but the contingency that made it not strictly dominant was one we don't have to consider. Zoom, zoom, eliminate them. Now we've gone from 3 by 3 to just 1 by 2. And notice that column player in this new twice simplified world, column player has a strictly dominant strategy again. They didn't have it all the time, but they had it once we made the appropriate scope limitation conditions. Zoom, zoom, zoom. And we wind up with a unique prediction. So we just took the elimination of strictly dominated strategies and we iterated it. We did it 3 times, or we did it in 3 stages. I actually did it 4 times. This is called the iterated elimination of strictly dominated strategies, IESDS. It's a really powerful tool because anything that survives IESDS, in particular this unique prediction, if you have a unique thing that survived IESDS, as in the prisoner's dilemma or as in this cleverly constructed game, that's the prediction. That's the only prediction that makes any sense because we got rid of the things that didn't make any sense in an interesting combination of orders. So IESDS is our first real tool for analyzing a game. And it's a very powerful tool because if you're able to narrow down the set of possibilities via IESDS, then what you've done is eliminate a lot of really red herring-y, confusing, but not really relevant outcomes. In the language of rationalism, these are not relevant things to have to think about. We don't want to have to worry about them, so zoom, 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 unique outcome. Now, the unique outcome part is very rare. The fact that IESDS provides such a compelling story also means that most of the time it's very weak. So for example, consider the assurance game. Zoom. So this is the assurance game. This is a very important game. It's similar to the prisoner's dilemma, right? But what changed is precisely the thing that creates strict dominance in prisoner's dilemma. So whereas the prisoner's dilemma had a single unique prediction from IESDS, they both defect. In the assurance game, we don't narrow it down at all. We had 4 possible outcomes going into IESDS. I've got no strictly dominated strategies to eliminate. I have completed my elimination of strictly dominated strategies. I've done it. I've done all the surgery I'm gonna do via IESDS on the assurance game. I didn't do anything. There's 4 possible outcomes. So IESDS produces a definite outcome in the prisoner's dilemma, and it's completely indeterminate in the assurance game. Most games are more like the assurance game than they are like the prisoner's dilemma, which is to say, more often than not, IESDS is not going to be the ending. It's a good beginning for an analysis, but with the assurance game, that beginning lasts for about a nanosecond. So strict dominance is a very compelling tool when you can use it, but you can't always use it. We as analysts are going to have different tools for analyzing models, different ways of turning a fable into its ending. And some fables are going to be very easy to create an ending for, and some fables are going to be a little bit harder. We're going to need different tools to come up with predictions for different fables. And IESDS is our first method of analysis. And depending on the model, it can be super useful, as in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, or not useful at all, as is the case in the assurance game. So your first step analyzing any model, before we do anything that I teach you in the next few weeks, before you do any Nash equilibrium, best response, blah, 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 before you do that, just do IESDS real fast. If it gets you to the ending, you're done. But if it doesn't, then keep going. But at the very least, you can proceed knowing that you got rid of everything that not only a rational country wouldn't worry about, but a rational and common knowledge having country would know about. It's a very powerful way to begin your analysis. And as you can see, it begins our interaction with our fables. It begins our way of turning outcomes into predicted outcomes. So what makes a game a game? 3 things: players, actions, outcomes. The rest is details. The rest is the story. The rest is the imbuing of meaning. The rest is the important part. You know, a game is important only in the sense that it helps us to say, oh, that looks like a game of chicken. That looks like a prisoner's dilemma. But that doesn't mean anything unless you actually have a relevant story, a relevant narrative to try to inject. It's just a collection of symbols, but it's also so much more. It's a tool for us to use, and when we use the tool of a game well, it really helps us to take this giant complex world where there's just lots of things happening in such a long time frame. It's so nice to be able to say that 2 historic events are similar in the sense that they both could be modeled via the same fable. The fact that any 2 wars could be modeled as if they're the same fable is amazing. Wars are idiosyncratic and wrinkled and nuanced. What could be similar about 2 wars? Well, the parts that we try to say are similar via the fable. The fable is our little connector. It's our little way of saying these 2 incidents are related because they have similar DNA, and that DNA is crystallized in the form of a particular game, a particular model, a particular fable. Not all the things have to be so consequential though, right? So coordinating on using the same units, metric or SI, that won't make it to the History Channel as much. There are fewer great movies about decisions about what sort of units to have. There are more war movies than there are metric movies. But if we fail to coordinate, bad things happen. Less stuff is made. There's more waste. There's 0 happiness points when there could have been 1. You know, we're going to talk a lot about conflict, but it can be something as technocratic and boring as making sure that we all have the same definition of a unit. That's a coordination thing. And if there are firms behind these sort of things, if there's a lot of incentive from interested parties to keep a status quo as it is, then suddenly this turns into a brinkmanship game of chicken very quickly too. So something boring can be something very interesting if you look at it from the right angle. So along these lines, I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. So in very broad brushstrokes, there are two dominant interpretations about what a model is and what it does in the social sciences or in other sciences. There's the scientific realism interpretation and the scientific instrumentalism interpretation. And I've been alluding to my own views on the subject, which are much more in the instrumentalist tradition. When I look at a model, I don't think that that's what's really happening. I don't think that countries are really driving at one another as if they're playing a game of chicken. Or even if the model had more realistic labels on different actions, it doesn't mean I think that's what's actually happening. I think that the fable is useful as a self-contained unit to help us to relate to wars with one another, or a war and a metric decision with one another, or a war and a sanction decision, or a sanction and a tariff. I want to look at this humiliating complexity in the world and be able to partition it. I want to be able to say that two things seem similar to me. Why is that important to say that two things are similar? How can you identify patterns if you don't know which things are the same? You can't. You need to be able to say that two things are the same in a sense. In what sense? In the sense that they can be related to the same fable. The scientific realist is far less concerned with this relate different states of affairs across incidents sort of thing, and is much more interested in trying to test the mechanism that is being proposed. So I don't think that chicken ever actually happens, so I don't think that there's a mechanism to test. A scientific realist might say, oh, well, no, you've told a story, you are now on the record, and it's incumbent upon you to test, to see if your proposed story actually works every time two people in cars drive toward one another real fast. Whatever your predicted outcome is, it has to be what happens in reality, else this model should be discarded. So in between my extreme view that everything ought to be kept in the Book of Fables, and the scientific realist point of view that only those things that survive rigorous and strenuous empirical tests should stay in the Book of Fables, lives a number of potential Aristotelian means. So my question is, how many tests must a fable fail before we decide to get rid of it from our Book of Fables? Suppose, for example, that we were trying to test the prisoner's dilemma. As you just learned in the C block, there is no ambiguity about what the predicted outcome from the prisoner's dilemma is. The predicted outcome from the prisoner's dilemma is the unique profile defect. No matter how you slice it, this dominance analysis is super strong, and it just winds up being true that any analysis method will get you the defect prediction. The predicted profile is defect in the prisoner's dilemma. There's no ambiguity. 100% of the time, there's no other way to see it. Now suppose that we collected data on every pair of prisoners that had ever been put into separate interrogation chambers. And suppose that we learned that 75% of prisoners defected on one another, but 25% of the time, one of the other three possibilities happened. They cooperated, or there was an asymmetric outcome. That's plausible, right? This is all doable. This all makes some sense. But our prediction of the prisoner's dilemma left no room for ambiguity. It was 100% of the time. That means that we're making an error 25% of the time in our predictions. So if somebody had called me in, if they were two prisoners they were interested in understanding, they might call me in as an expert on the prisoner's dilemma. I have 8 PhDs in the prisoner's dilemma, right? And they'd call me in and I would say, well, I'm telling you, the prisoner's dilemma, the unique outcome of the prisoner's dilemma is defect. So you should expect these two prisoners to defect on one another. Well, that means that there's a 1 in 4 chance, if I'm wrong 25% of the time, there's a 1 in 4 chance that something else is going to happen. So let's suppose that something else happened. And I'm sitting there looking like an idiot. Now, does that mean that I should never write down a prisoner's dilemma again? Does that mean that the prisoner's dilemma is a bad model? Does that mean that I need to go back to the drawing board? And if so, do I have to erase the entire drawing board, or do I get to sort of keep things as they were and then try to tweak them just a little bit? Should I interview these two prisoners who didn't defect? Should I say, hey, why didn't you defect? Well, I should. Yes, I should. Suppose that they told me that the reason that they didn't defect was that they both happened to have a vision of Elvis Presley coming to visit them in their room. And the king, Elvis Presley, looked at them and said, "Hey, don't defect," and then vanished. Suppose this was true. There's all sorts of reasons that people might not defect. Now, was it on me to understand that? Should I work that into the model? Should my utility function now be 4 plus C sub Elvis, where C sub Elvis is 1 if the king came to visit you and 0 otherwise? No, don't overfit. What you're saying is that my beautiful model should now depend more on something incredibly idiosyncratic, something that isn't likely to happen very often among pairs of prisoners. It's unlikely they're going to get visited by Elvis. Now, I chose the most random thing I could think of, but it could be other things. It could be how big was the crime? It could be, was there a good cop, bad cop situation played? It could be, are they related to one another? Or how long have they been in their cadre together? There's all sorts of other factors, some of which seem crazy, some of which don't. Well, how do you know which are crazy and which aren't? You know the Elvis one is a little bit weird, but how do you know that good cop, bad cop matters? Maybe that's just as crazy. Maybe that's just as irrelevant. How do you know the temperature doesn't matter? How do you know barometric pressure doesn't matter? How do you know who the president is doesn't matter? You don't. Everything is related in some infinitesimal way, but my model I didn't write it down to get prisoners right. I wrote it down to be able to relate states of affairs. And if you're asking me to incorporate every little Elvis hallucination into my model so that I can get it 100% right so that you can keep your scientific, realist, empiricist self happy, then you're being a jerk, because I wrote these fables not because I thought they were true. I wrote them down because I thought they were useful. And you're making them less useful every time that you add an Elvis hallucination to them. So what I mean to say is, contemporary international relations is complicated. Predicting the future of international relations is complicated. Understanding the history of international relations is complicated. There's no way you're going to be able to fold in every Elvis hallucination, nor every other less laughable factor. We don't write fables down to try to get everything right. We write fables down to help us to say, the War of 1812 seems an awful lot to me like the Franco-Prussian War. This is why I want to hold off on the analysis for a week. I don't want us to think about the predictions too much just yet, because the predictions aren't why we wrote the model down. We care about the predictions, yeah, don't get me wrong. It's not like I want a model that gets everything wrong all the time, and that would be like some badge of honor for me. What's more hipster than that? I only write down models that are always wrong. But that's not the end-all be-all. That's not the summum bonum. That isn't the only way to evaluate a model. That's not the metric. We write down fables because they're for us. It's a part of our human experience to tell stories. And it turns out that if you learn how to tell a story a certain way, then it becomes scientifically useful to you. Ours is a species of storytellers. We know this from the ancients. In various civilizations, there are wonderful stories, wonderful fables, wonderful mythology, wonderful epics. And these epics just aren't just about what they're about. You could read the Odyssey today, Homer's Odyssey, and much of it would matter to you. Not because you actually think that there's witches that live on certain islands in the Mediterranean, but because there's something to be said for the importance of getting home after a long and arduous task. The Odyssey is a fun thing to read because you can inject a little bit of yourself into it. You can feel that quixotic journey that Odysseus goes on. And even though you don't have to worry about lashing yourself to the mast of a ship so you don't have to hear the sweet song of a siren, even if you don't have to worry about the Scylla and the Charybdis and how they could bring your ship down any time, even though none of that is true, they are symbols. You have a Scylla, you have a Charybdis, you have a Circe. Now, I don't know your Circe. I don't know your Scylla. I don't know your Charybdis. But the act of having one is something that you and Odysseus had in common. And so the Odyssey helps us to relate his state of affairs to yours. We've been doing this for millennia. It's just that now we have different ways to do it. Probably the least satisfying thing about the Odyssey is how it ends. What a story is about and how it ends are such different things, and it's really annoying. We kind of live in a world now where people like to rattle off all the things that that they think that they know or that they've experienced. I've read all these books, or I've seen all these movies, or I understand all this. I've taken all these classes. Look how smart I am. I have all these credentials. I can make all these predictions. I'm right all the time. It's not about that all the time, though. Chicken and assurance, they might not resonate with you, but they're about something. They're a story. They're a useful story, it turns out. But they're also a beautiful story. So, for a week at least, let's try to see all of the beautiful tensions in international relations, not as a means to some deeper end, but as a beautiful end in itself. Thanks for watching.